that exercise, the alternative uses exercise, you came up with as many uses for this object, an umbrella, as possible. You should have felt rushed. You should have felt basically in a mood where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to put so many things down and I don't have enough time to do it. That's the actual point of the alternative uses exercise. It is meant to get yourself essentially out of your own head. It's meant to not allow you the time to edit your own ideas. That's an important aspect of the alternative uses exercise, and it basically is a good demonstration of what is called divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is basically the bread and butter of the creative process. It's the bread and butter of an entrepreneurial mindset, looking forward to connecting ideas across disciplines to make new ideas. So let's talk a little bit about what divergent thinking is and what you just experienced in that exercise. Divergent thinking refers to the way the mind generates ideas beyond the prescribed expectations and rote thinking. You may have heard that called thinking outside the box. That's exactly what you were forced to do by coming up with multiple uses for an umbrella. I'd be curious to know if any of you basically came up with an umbrella that was 50 feet wide. I didn't say you couldn't make an umbrella that was that big, but then you come up with much more uses if you consider all the different ways you can think of that umbrella. That's a very good exercise to practice because it gets you, again, outside of your own head and into new ideas. Questioning assumptions is a very important aspect of divergent thinking. Questioning your own assumptions. Why do we do it this way? Why have we always done it that way? Some of the best minds in history, Galileo proposed to his colleagues that the Earth was actually rotating around the sun and that the sun was not rotating around the Earth. It's laughable now, but in those days, he was simply questioning the assumption, and he was ostracized for thinking that way at all. So questioning assumptions is another important aspect to divergent thinking. Next, ability to see multiple solutions to a problem. You just came up with multiple uses for one object. The same is true for problems. If we see multiple solutions to a problem, we're more than likely going to be able to solve that problem. Think about and see problems visually as a designer. I've often told colleagues, if I can draw it, I can understand it. Designers really see things visually, and you may as well. There's nothing all wrong with that. With seeing things visually, seeing how things might map out visually can help crack the code, you might say, on a particular problem. And the ability to boil complex topics down to metaphors and analogies. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying that, for example, these 4 topics, poetry, dance, music, and art, are really nothing more than a metaphor or an analogy for a specific way of speaking. Some things can only be expressed in music. Certain emotions, certain feelings can only be expressed in music and not in text. Poetry, dance, and art are the same way when it comes to that. I'm going to talk to you about my particular area, design. I'll give you a quick example of using metaphors and analogies in design, and it gets back to my own classes. I have right out of the gate in my design classes, I have students do one of these. It's a dream box. A dream box is basically students making an object, a basic box that expresses a dream or emotional event that they've felt. The beauty of this particular project is that students don't say anything when they actually present their projects. They merely let the box speak for itself. It could be a combination of texture, color, light, sound, and it's the job of the audience, the other classmates, to guess what their dream was about. And you'd be pretty surprised how close some guesses come to what the actual dream was about, depending on the abilities of that designer. So design is a wonderful nonverbal language that I think is a really interesting one thinking about divergent thinking. All right, finally, basically, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time from Federico Garcia Lorca. The poem, the song, the picture is only water drawn from the well of the people, and it should be given back to them in a cup of beauty so that they may drink, and in drinking, understand themselves. That's basically what divergent thinking is. It's a channel. It's a volumetric piece that we can give to an audience and say, this is what I'm thinking. This song, this poem, this picture. That's a really wonderful kind of quote that I've long loved. All right, moving along. When it comes to divergent thinking, NASA in the late 1960s had 2 good problems. They had one of their first good problems they had too many applicants for too few jobs. The other problem they had was they needed a way to basically come up with a test that could test the creativity or divergent thinking abilities of the applicants that did apply for jobs there. But I want to go back a little bit to this particular clip from Apollo 13. Yes, it's a dramatization, but I think it's an important lesson in basically, in this case, people using a constraint as a catalyst to be creative.
Gene, We have a situation brewing with the carbon dioxide.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module,
5 filters on the limb.
which were meant for 2 guys for a day and a half. So I told the doc,
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
They take square cartridges.
The ones on the limb are round.
Tell me this isn't a government operation.
This just isn't a contingency we've remotely looked at.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs handed us this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going, too, someone.
All right, and if you don't know, those astronauts were saved by those on the ground who came up with this. This is an actual photo of the square peg and the round hole solution to saving those 3 astronauts, at least getting them home long enough to survive that flight. All right, so NASA had this problem. They had lots of great applicants for a very few positions, so NASA came to 2 doctors, Dr. George Land and Dr. Beth Jarman, and said, we need you to come up with a divergent thinking exercise, a test that will test our applicants. And so they came up with a very simple divergent thinking test. And out of about 280,000 applicants, about 2% were what were considered creative genius level when it came to acing this particular test. But what was interesting about that was not that test, but the actual application of that test to 1,600 children ages 4 to 5. So Dr. Land and Dr. Jarman said, well, hey, this test is so simple, why don't we give it to kids? And would you believe it? 98% of students aged 4 to 5 were creative level geniuses when it came to that particular divergent thinking test. With it being a longitudinal study, meaning that they gave the same test to the same students over a 5-year period, about 30% only at age 10 were considered genius level creatives, and then on in age 15 only about 12%. So to me, that's indicative of basically what we think of as a sort of a straight line way of education. If you think of it that way, basically, you and I have been educated in a system that looks a little bit like this. 5-year-olds are clustered together, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds are clustered together, all by what Sir Ken Robinson used to call by date of manufacture. But anyone that knows, you all may have siblings, you know that 2 5-year-olds can be radically different from each other. So basically, this way of thinking of education is quite honestly, historically, it is an economic system, an industrial age model. Think of an assembly line of cars. We are assembly lines of students exiting education with what we think are the essentials, but we're clustering those students in age, by age bracket. Quite honestly, you and I experience a little bit more like this. It's a little bit more of a messy curve. This is what's called a wicked problem. A wicked problem in the design world, as a specific definition for that, is that it's difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and with changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. Now think about that as if we are the manufactured objects, that we as students basically our education is a journey that is quite often incomplete, contradictory, and with changing requirements that are difficult to recognize. So quite honestly, I think more often than not, if you feel at the beginning of your 2 or beginning of your 4-year college career, if you feel like you're all over the map before you can eventually make that a straight line, that's actually normal. That is par for the course, you might say, when it comes to a normal progress of education. In fact, I'll show you an example here of a student. I was at a conference and saw a student put this graph up, and I thought this was just amazing. She had taken the time to map out her different areas of interest, and you'll see in her first year she was all over the map when it came to her interests, and that's just fine. That's actually how that's supposed to work. And then as time goes on, you find out what you'd like to do for the rest of your life, you might say. You at least find out what you'd like to do post-graduation, and that line becomes, the chaos becomes a little bit more of a straight line. All right, and then I want to share this particular example with you. This is basically an audit of professionals from about 2010 of leadership essentials, leadership and entrepreneurial leadership essentials. What are employers looking for in recent college graduates? And they came up with a graph like this. This will clear up in just a second, but this graph more or less illustrates a number of things that you cannot necessarily take a subject matter class in. You don't take a class in being a T-shaped thinker. You don't take a class in failure. You don't take a class in telling a compelling story, unless you want to think of theater as a way of doing that. You can't take a class in being comfortable with ambiguity either. These are what the industry, I think, would call soft skills, but quite honestly, between you and I hate that term. It implies that these are not important skills. They are actually very, very important skills to have. Moving along here, this is a guy named Kai-Fu Lee. Kai-Fu Lee is considered the father of artificial intelligence, and even he, with artificial intelligence now being a bit of a common term, even he cites that there are 4 things that AI cannot replicate. They are creativity, dexterity, compassion, and complexity. So think about that. Think about creativity as a way to have a leg up on the competition, if you might think of it that way. What is this? This is nothing more than a roll of aluminum foil, correct? Well, if you're a kid, it isn't. If you're a kid, you look at that aluminum foil and you say, well, I know what it is, but what can I do with it? And kids are pros at this. They know that what they can do basically are cognitive combinations, much better than many of our adults can. But let me give you an example of an entrepreneur himself, Van Phillips. Van Phillips was fascinated for a number of years with the Chinese sword, the strength and durability and flexibility of the Chinese sword, and he had a very important reason to care. He was missing a leg, and he questioned the assumption, as good divergent thinkers do, he questioned the assumption as to why a leg, a prosthetic limb, must look like an actual leg. He said, I actually want something that responds to my movement. And so he gave rise to basically empowering people who were amputees to run again. And it's a very powerful example of a cognitive combination. If you think of it, you are a walking, talking version of this particular schematic. You might be taking classes in these areas or more, and you're developing deep analytical skills in these different areas. But only you can connect the dots across this horizontal. That's about taking existing ideas and making new ones. And that's quite honestly where innovation occurs. When you connect across different topics, where you take one idea from one subject and connect it to another and make something new. So I'll give you an example of a student of mine, Logan Rogge. He was an amazing, amazing student here where I teach, and shared this with me. It's a Minecraft controller for a 3-year-old with disabilities. This was what Logan loved to do. If you think of Logan and this typical kind of divergent thinking chart, Logan's interest crossed across mechanical engineering, art, and child psychology. Logan wanted to help kids who had disabilities. So more often than not, we are empathetic designers. We want to do is exactly what Logan wants to do, and that is help people. Being a design thinker, being a divergent thinker. This is an example of a guy named Bruce Mao. Bruce Mao is a designer who is a founder of a place called Center for Massive Change.
The content of the experience that you need to learn, it's the experience of the content. It's the experience that you need to learn. You need to know that you can be lost in the forest and find your way out. And it is, I mean, we thought about calling it the Lost in the Forest Institute, that it would be, there's a difference between being on a picnic and being lost in the forest. When you're on a picnic, you might be in the very same place, but on a picnic, you don't care too much about the environment that you're in. Your concern is, who brought the Coke and who's got the sandwiches. When you're lost in the forest, every piece of information is important to you. The fact that, the land slopes this way and the sun is over there and I can hear water, well, all of that information is immediately relevant. That's what an entrepreneur does. An entrepreneur processes everything, all the information, as tools. An entrepreneur looks at a landscape, looks at a situation and says, you know what? I could use these 3 things and put them together to make a new thing that people really need.
All right. So think about that. Think about maybe your high school years as being on a picnic. You knew exactly where you had to be and how long you had to be there and what was going to be on the test. But a higher education journey is more about being lost in the woods in a good way. Being lost in the woods in the sense that the journey itself may be a little messy, it may be a little chaotic, but if you think like an entrepreneur does, everything becomes relevant to you. All the different pieces, maybe different components of different classes come together in an aha moment for you, or maybe a slow maturation of an idea. But that's an important way to think of yourself as an entrepreneurial learner.